So after you finish installing Gen 2, what you actually have is the Linux operating system with the Portage Package Manager, which is the Gen 2 part. And then as default, you have the bash shell. So the shell is kind of like the user interface. Linux is the thing that is keeping the computer running, connecting all the components, and then it needs to make a connection to you as a user. So your user interface is your connection to the computer, and that is the shell. So selecting the shell that fits your needs is crucial for how you use your system and how well you can use your system. So just to explain that the Linux kernel is called a kernel because it's at the center, it's controlling everything. And around the kernel you have a shell, which is the user interface. And you use the shell, as a user, you use the shell to access the kernel and use the computer, but you also use the shell to start applications. And the applications use the shell and the kernel as well. So many times the applications is what you will be actually interfacing with. But before you interface with the application, you will interface through the shell. So the first thing you're going to install, the first thing you get after you installed your Gen 2 Linux is that you have the bash shell, which is a console terminal. Terminal is the same as terminated. It's the end user point. So typically in the Unix world, you would have a server and then you would have terminals where you connect to the server. So that you would sit at the console terminal, which was just a screen and a keyboard, and you will access the server from there. And so then you access the kernel would be on the server, and you will access the server through a network interface. And over the network interface, you would use a shell to run your commands and start applications, such as Lynx, for example. Lynx is a terminal-based web browser. Now, if you're just running Gen 2 on your local computer, you're not going to use the network interface. You're just going to use the shell to access the kernel. So this one can be skipped when you're using a desktop computer. You could also use a graphical user interface. So a graphical user interface, for example, KDE, also has the kernel, Linux. Instead of having the terminal server, it has a Windows server, which is x.org. There used to be others, but they're no longer being developed, so this is the only alternative that is left. And unlike the terminal, the console terminal, when you use your desktop computer, you're always going to run the Windows server, even if you're at your local computer. And you connect to that server through kind of like a shell, but it's going to be a bit different than the terminal shell. Because when you run the console terminal, you start the shell, or actually this shell will start automatically. The first thing that's going to happen is it's going to ask you to identify yourself and log on as a user. And then after you log on, you will get access to the prompt for typing some commands. When you use a graphical user interface, you first have a display manager, which will create a screen for you where you can identify as a user. And you will be able to log in with your username and password. Then the display manager will hand over to a window manager. So if we use this example of KDE, the window manager would be KWin. And then the window manager wants to paint up some menus and stuff. And those menus will be provided by a desktop environment, which in this case would be Plasma. So these three components interact to enable you to launch applications. And then, for example, you could load up a terminal emulator to pretend that you're at the terminal console, and you can start your terminal-based web browser through there. The benefit, when you have a console terminal, you have 5 different screens. So control, you hold the keys Control-Alt. If you're on a Mac, I guess it's something else, but I don't know. On a PC, it's Control-Alt, and you press F1 for the first console terminal. F2 will open a new screen on your monitor, and you can log in as a different user or as the same user in a different shell. F3, F4, F5, different screens. And kind of by default, F7, I think, is going to be the graphical terminal. So you can run 5 different console terminals even though you're not using a graphical user interface. But when you use the graphical user interface, you can run 20 console terminals if you should wish. And you can copy paste text between them. And you have lots of reasons for using a graphical user interface beyond that, of course. So pretty much everyone are going to end up using a graphical user interface. Unless you're going to actually connect to a different server, which is kind of a bit of a paradox, because the network interface in a console terminal is optional. You can just use your desktop with a shell and skip that. But if you connect to a remote server, you're going to use the terminal interface. You're not going to use the Windows server as an interface to a different server, because the network bandwidth is so high that it's just impractical and slow. So no one's going to use the Windows server as a server. It's just kind of here to serve you on your desktop. And because of that, they made a different alternative that we will talk about later. So what can you choose in terms of terminal shells? Well, the Born Again shell is the default for Linux. It's also the default for Mac OS. And it's also used in a lot of FreeBSD or other Unix derivatives. So since it's so common, it's actually great to just use that one, because you're going to recognize the environment pretty much anywhere you go. The other popular one is the C shell, which has a lot more programming features. So if you're going to live your entire life by the terminal and every day spend lots of time with the terminal, maybe you're going to start using C shell instead, because you can modify it in lots of different ways. But because it's so extensionable, it's a bit difficult to use. Now, being able to modify and do our own thing is kind of what Gentoo is about. But even though you use Gentoo, you're still probably going to use a graphical user environment. So I still think that the C shell is extreme user environment. It's not for everyone. But what do I know? What a lot of people are going to do when they install the C shell is that they want to get syntax highlighting, and they want to get some other features functioning. And then you have Fish, which have all of that already configured. So Fish doesn't have a lot of programming features for you as a user, but they already have this kind of thing functioning that a lot of C shell users want. So actually, the logical progression, if you don't want Bash, is that you're going to move over to Fish. And if Fish is not enough, you're going to move over to C shell. Yeah, I think for most people, just staying with Bash is fine because you're going to use the graphical user interface anyway. But there are many other options as well. There's the TC shell, there's the C shell, there's the TK shell or something like that. I don't remember. And well, there are many options. So just find whatever you like. But I think most people will be fine with Bash. So the graphical shell is very different. Because you have the X server running, that's going to be kind of like an interface to the Linux kernel. But the X server also needs to access the graphics card and some hardware. And then they start building network interfaces and stuff, because that's such a big part of what we do. So the X server has sort of become its own operating system on its own. Even though Linux is supposed to be the operating system. And this is the same kind of symptom that systemd is suffering from. That they want to take over stuff from the Linux kernel that they really shouldn't be doing. But anyway, this is the way it's been for a long time now. And then you have the display manager interfacing with the X server and creating a session for you as a user. You have the window manager communicating with the X server to tell the X server what to display. And then you have the desktop environment telling the window manager what should happen on screen. And then you have all your different apps that's going to interface with your Windows system to be displayed from your X server. And the point of the X server is that you're supposed to be able to connect to a different computer or something, or someone from a different computer should be able to connect to you over the internet. But the bandwidth requirements are so big that it's practically never done. So because of that, they've started to replace the X server with an X protocol called Wayland. So Wayland just doesn't accept any connections from the internet. It's just a protocol where they provide a buffer in the memory that these programs interact with kind of the same way as with the X server. But they just write what they want to display on the screen, they write to a buffer, and that buffer is put by Wayland onto the screen. So this is just because almost everyone will just use their graphical user interface locally. There's no point of having a server that could become a security risk or something like that, and it's also not well suited for its purpose actually, or because of all of the developments with modern graphics and stuff. It's just that Xorg is not the best way to deal with it, and Wayland should be a lot better. But on the other hand, you can't connect from other computers. So if you want to have that server interface, I'm not sure why you would want that, but if you want that, then of course you shouldn't use Wayland. But for anyone who's just using a desktop computer, just use Wayland. So the display managers are just used to create a session for you where you log on and identify yourself as a user. And there are many different display managers, and they look a bit different, but it really doesn't matter much which one you're going to pick. GDM is the GNOME display manager, but even if you use that display manager, you can tell it that actually you want to run a KDE session or an LXDE session or anything else, and it's going to do that for you. So it doesn't matter which one you pick. For window managers, it definitely matters which one you pick because they're very different. And there are three types of desktop managers. There's the tiling window managers, there's the stacking, and the compositing. So we're going to go through each of these. The tiling window managers just put windows in tiles next to each other. There's one window here, one window here, one window here, one window here. And you can move them between different slots. You can, well, navigate between these. But sort of the point of having tiling window managers is that you're not going to use a mouse. You're just going to use the keyboard. So you're just going to switch to a different window and do something and switch back. And it's meant to be kind of like a static setup. A much more dynamic setup, which the setup that we're used to from Windows, is to have a stacking window manager. And stacking means that it's going to paint the desktop on the screen. And then if you have a window, it's going to paint the window on top of that desktop on the screen. And then if you have another window, it's going to paint that window on top of the other desktop and on top of the desktop, so that the topmost window will be the one that is visible. So you get a stack of pictures sort of on top of each other. So that's the stacking window manager. The problem with that is what we see on the screen here, where you have a window here. This window is functioning well, but the desktop or the Ice Weasel window in the background here, that one stopped functioning. So because it stopped functioning, it stopped repainting itself. So the window manager is going to tell that window to repaint yourself and give me the new, what you look like. And then it's going to paint that, and it's going to then paint this window on top. But if this window stops working, then it's not going to repaint itself. So it's just going to be this window that's painted over and over and over again. And when you move this window around, the old images will never disappear because they will never be repainted. So it's a bit ugly, but it only happens when one of these applications you run hang, so they stop repainting themselves. So a way to come around that and to also give some more functionality is to use a compositing window manager. So the compositing window manager, it just gives every application a memory buffer, and it says that in this memory buffer you should paint your contents. And then the compositing window manager is going to put that memory buffer on the screen in any way you like, which means you can get this really neat effect, like in this picture, you're alt-tab in between applications, and they're just viewing these pictures not stacked on top of each other, but they can view them in 3D and move them around from different angles, so that when you flip between applications, you get some really neat effects. You can also add some neat effects, like when you close a window, it's going to break up in 1,000 pieces and fall down the screen or something. So in terms of eye candy, this is really nice. And when an application is going to crash or hang, it also doesn't look quite as ugly. But on the other hand, it's going to use a lot more system resources, and that means that your system is going to be a bit slower. So it's up to you if you want to sacrifice some speed for having a kind of flashy, beautiful screen. What's interesting about the Compositing Window Manager is that Wayland, which is the alternative to the X server, is actually also using the same kind of method. So in Wayland, you get a buffer for the screen that the window manager uses. So the window manager prints its screen to a buffer. And then if you have a compositing window manager, that window manager is going to ask the application to write to a buffer in the same way. So Wayland and compositing window managers work with the same kind of method. So it seems like that's like the way forward that the developers want to take. But we still have a lot of popular stacking window managers around. So just a few examples of what to choose from. I mean, there are many, many options. But for a tiling, for example, rat poison, it's called rat poison because you want to get rid of your mouse and just use the keyboard. There's also one called i3, which is good. But most people are probably not going to want the tiling window manager because you still want to use the mouse. The reason why we have a mouse is because it's a very efficient way of navigating through information. So the stacking window manager is kind of like Windows uses, or at least they used to use that. I'm not sure what Windows 10 uses or the newer ones, but anyway. OpenBox is very popular because it's very easy to modify it and configure it in many different ways. So it's very flexible, which is great. Enlightenment is another one that is popular, a rather new one actually. And they focus on getting as much eye candy as possible, which is a bit weird because this shows a stacking window manager. It seems like if you want as much eye candy as possible, you should go for the compositing window manager, but maybe I'm not sure what they want actually. But they're supposed to be about eye candy and being a beautiful window system, whereas this is supposed to be a very flexible and configurable window system. If you look at compositing window manager, for example, Compass is a very famous one, renamed to Beryl for a while. And for KDE, there's the KWin one. There's also MetaCity or something, and a few others. But yeah, those are some alternatives. You should really read up on what you want to use if you don't already know that. But after you pick the window manager, you need to fill the windows with some content. And there are two major systems for doing that. One is Qt and one is GTK. You're actually supposed to say this Qt, but I don't like that, so I'm going to say Qt. This is the GIMP toolkit, which was developed just to make the Photoshop, the open source version of Photoshop, which is called the GIMP. So they developed their own toolkit for menus and stuff, because as a programmer, it's really annoying if you have to write the code for a button every time you make a button, because you're going to make a lot of buttons and you're going to make a lot of menus and whatever else. So then you make a toolkit to just say that I want a button, and when I press it, I want to execute some code. And Qt is the same idea and a widget toolkit. So I did some programming myself, and I have to say that Qt is so much better, in my opinion, when you're a programmer. It has lots of neat features and it's very easy to use. It's very fast to get something done. And you can use Qt in Python for a prototype and just move it over to C or C++ and use kind of the same code, which is excellent. So for me, uh, I'm just a full supporter of the Qt toolkit. And that means that actually it's going to be kind of easy for me to put together a desktop environment and make my choices. Because I know I want to use Qt myself and I want to support Qt applications. You can mix Qt and GTK, of course, but again, that means that you're going to have two different widget kits eating up system resources, which means that your computer will be a little bit slower. So it's better if you can just make it pure Qt or pure GTK if you prefer that. Of course, there's one other thing to consider, which is that Qt is generically used in KDE, which is kind of like a copy of the Windows environment, whereas GTK is typically used in GNOME, which is kind of like a copy of the Macintosh Apple environment. So if you prefer the Mac environment, you're going to go for GTK if you're not a programmer who likes Qt. And if you're a fan of Windows, you're going to go for Qt. Personally, I kind of prefer something in between. So that means that I'm going to modify it a bit for my needs. But the point is, if I know that I'm going to use Qt, I can look at the different Linux distributions. And the reason why I should look at different Linux distributions is that when they use components together, they have a team of programmers sitting there figuring out what could go wrong and making sure that all of the different components work well together. So Qt is the default used by KDE, which uses Plasma and Kwin, SDDM, and Xorg. And they are also trying their best to support Wayland. So this root, so this combination, is a very strong combination that has been tried and tested, and lots of bugs have been removed. Plasma is also commonly used with OpenBox, and OpenBox is also commonly used with the simple desktop display manager, which has support for both Xorg and Wayland. So you could also combine Plasma with OpenBox if you don't want the extra system resources for Kwin and the Compositing window manager. Or if you prefer to have the flexibility of OpenBox. On the other hand, there's also LXQT, which is more lightweight desktop environment than Plasma, and Plasma is more like Windows, and LXQT is more like in between Windows and Macintosh, which is actually exactly what I want. And LXQT can be used with lots of different window managers, but commonly used with OpenBox, which is commonly used with SDDM. And this is a configuration that is exactly what I want. Is very feature-rich, flexible, configurable window manager with something between Macintosh and Windows as a desktop environment and using Qt. And this is used in some distributions as well, so it's a combination that has been tried and tested a lot. So that's one way of going about trying to figure out how to put together your graphical user interface. So then my shell choices would be bash. Just why not? If I'm going to switch this, I'm going to switch to fish. And then, like I said, this track. That's my choice. I mean, if you are one of those people who want to go the GNOME path, you're probably going to have the GDM, because that's always used with GNOME. You're probably going to have something like MetaCity or something as a window manager, and the GNOME desktop environment with GTK, because it's work great together. But you could also run GNOME with OpenBox or SDDM with GNOME or whatever you want. I mean, the combinations are infinite. But if you look at some distributions to see how they combine things, and if it looks like that combination can fill your needs, then I think you should go for that combination. Just because it's going to save you some trouble, since they already sold a lot of interaction things. So that's it about shells.